All right. Well, this is a Salem Digital Photography Group workshop on camera settings. Oh, there you are. I can see you come up. And the place to start is I want to share this screen so that it will be on the video. Woo, here it is. So that if people are watching the video later down the road and want to know how to find the handout, well, here's what you type in order to get to the handout. The handout's 13 pages long, and I tried to be pretty thorough in describing the things that I was bringing to the table today. Other people in the workshop may have other ideas, and if you're watching this and you're having struggle with your camera for something else, well, there are lots of people in the club, me included, and we're glad to try and help. So share your questions and hopefully you'll get answers. Now, we've got three different ways to approach what we can show today. Uh, we can show the video looking at me, which is probably the least interesting of the group. Another view that we have is through my camera, so you can see what my camera sees. Whoop! I just knocked my spare glasses on the floor. That wasn't good. All right, so I'll take the lens cap off here and just give you a quick demonstration. What
Are
this
you, what kind of camera is this?
this is a Nikon Z9, but what we're going to talk about is pretty good for any camera that you want to talk about. But some of the menus, we kind of have to be able to show the camera through the lens, or it doesn't make sense what I'm talking about on the menus. So we've got this beast over here, and we've got, you see, I'm switching between all of these things, and it's going to take me a minute to go back and forth. And then we have my screen, which I have. Doo, 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 doo. The manual for my camera. Now, that isn't because this camera is special, it's because we got to start somewhere, and this gives us a way to see things on a camera that will kind of provide a guide about different buttons. I know your camera probably has different buttons, but they're all kind of the same in a lot of ways. So I'm hoping you can see this screen. It says getting to know camera menus. You know, we all have a camera manual. And when I got this camera, I downloaded the manual and I saw that it was over 900 pages long. And I thought, well, golly, they must have a section for English and a section for Spanish, section for French and German and Italian and Japanese, and that I really only have about 100 pages to go through. No. This camera, the manual actually is over 900 pages long. And it goes through, like your camera manual probably does, uh, all the little intricate things, whether they matter or not. And it's written by an engineer, not a photographer. So it's not prioritizing the different things you need to know to actually take pictures. It's kind of a catalog of all the different things that the camera will do. And so what I've tried to do in this handout is move toward what you actually can benefit, at least prioritize benefit from as you set up your camera. Now, the way I want to start is to give a quick tour of this camera and the different buttons and what they do, because we're going to be talking about the what they do later as we go along. As you look down at the camera, you see a ring on the left side. Now, underneath that ring, you've got different settings for your shutter. Press it and get one picture, press and get 6 pictures a second, press and get 20 pictures a second, press and get 30 JPEGs per second, or 60 JPEGs, or 125 JPEGs per second. And it's also got this button that lets you make that adjustment. This is button 14, lets you make that adjustment with your dial over here.
I don't,
Uh,
I'm not seeing what you're talking about there. What I'm
Okay,
seeing is you.
you're seeing me. Well, that's awful because I think I'm sharing my screen.
You're not.
Okay, let's go back because we want to share this screen if we can. I hit
I
share
was
screen.
the screen. It had a black and white diagram of your camera, and
Yep,
you had the mouse hovering over the dial on the left-hand side.
that's what I'm hoping you're seeing, Madeline. I should be back
There it
to
is
that.
again.
All right, hang on. Let me. Oh, okay. I see it. I'm sorry. I had something blocking it.
All righty.
There
Well,
we go.
this
Okay.
dial here, you've got settings for bracketing exposures. Bracketing exposures lets you take a series of exposures and you set the exposure increment between them. For example, when I bracket exposures, I take 9 exposures. I have the shutter speed change to increase the exposure by 1 stop between each one. Uh, and when you press these buttons, you can adjust the dials over here to change the settings. This is for flash, mainly for flash compensation. This here is the record button for video. The beautiful thing about modern cameras is you can reprogram these buttons to do whatever you want. And a lot of the art of customizing a camera for your own needs is reprogramming the buttons. I have this button reprogrammed as a depth of field preview button. The ISO button, now ISO button allows you to change the ISO with this dial or change between auto ISO and set ISO with this dial. Exposure compensation. We're going to go to the next screen here. Doop, 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 doop. Here we go. On the front, we've got 3 function buttons. Now, your camera may only have 2, but most cameras, this top function button is set up as a depth of field preview button. And anymore, I use the depth of field preview so seldom that I reprogram this. What I use the most is switching between matrix metering and spot metering. And I hit this button and I get spot metering. And then on the back, we're going to look here in a second, but I have these 2 buttons for different focus modes. I have this button set for 3D autofocus and this button set for a static point autofocus. Over here is a button to control different focus modes, and we're going to talk about that. I'm only trying to hit the things that really matter as we go through this. We're going to go down one more page and look at the back of the camera. Back of the camera, you've got this. See this little twister thing? That's the diopter correction. A person wants to set the viewfinder so that it corrects for your eyesight. And if your camera gets blurry and you feel like you can't see anything, probably you've bumped that dial. They look different on every camera, but that allows me to shoot without glasses, and being able to see the menus and see what I'm shooting is a big advantage. Over here, autofocus button. Now, on most every camera, there is a button located right here for the thumb of your right hand. And you press that button, and by default, it focuses your lens. Now, that's wonderful, but most cameras by default also, if you press the shutter button halfway, it will focus the camera. Turn the focusing off on the shutter button so that the only way you can focus the camera is by pressing the autofocus button. That's a big advantage because there are times when you don't want the camera to focus. For example, you have something in the foreground off to the side that you want to take a picture of, and you want to be able to focus on that, But every time you move that thing out of the center and you press your shutter button, it will automatically refocus on the background and you lose the focus on the foreground object. If you have autofocus turned off on your shutter button and you're exclusively using the back button focus, to make it not focus, all you've got to do is take your finger off the button. So it puts you in complete control of your focusing. This changes different appearances in the display. This changes between shooting stills and shooting video. I don't shoot video. This is a multi-directional thing with a button in the center you can press. I found it handy for only one thing. This is where I have the exposure lock programmed. That way, if I get an exposure that I want and I want to use it to either reposition the camera or shoot a panorama, I press that button and the exposure values stay locked until I either press the button again or turn off the camera. That's a really, excuse me, a really handy feature, and that's where I put it. The reason you want to be able to lock exposure is I use this with spot metering. Remember, I had the button on the front that I had programmed to spot meter. And let's say I have a bird on a branch against the bright sky. I know if I shoot that bird straight up, even with spot metering, the bird is going to be silhouetted against the sky. But if I quickly angle my camera down into the bushes and then lock the exposure with this button and then bring it up to shoot the bird, then I'm going to have an exposure that's right for the bird and the stick that it's sitting on, and the sky background is not going to throw me off. So this is a really handy feature to have. This is the information button. We're going to talk about that later. That brings up a bunch of settings in your screen. Down here is the menu button. Now, of course, that shows you the camera menus, but the handy part of that is that you can have the menu area preset to the settings you want it to show you first. I have a My menu, which we're going to show in a minute, that has the settings that I most often change, and I have that set. And then when I press the menu button, it takes me right there. This is the preview button to see your pictures. And then there is a bunch of other buttons down here that really work. This is an alternative shutter button, so you can shoot vertical pictures. And a lot of this stuff is redundant for use when your hand is positioned under the, with it at a vertical. I think that is the extent of the camera tour. Let me go down one more screen and see if there's something vital that I missed. Oh, this is showing the front buttons and the alternative shutter release and the tripod socket, things like that. So that's a quick tour of the camera. Now I'm going to go back and let you look at me. Hopefully, there I am. And we're going to talk through some of the things in the handout. I'm going to need to find my glasses so I can see it. Image area. Most cameras let you decide whether you're going to have the image made up of the entire sensor or some subset of that. When it makes sense to use this setting. First of all, if you have a full frame camera and you have a DX lens or a crop frame lens, it makes sense to reset the image area so that the camera is only sampling the part of the frame that the lens will focus to, because the DX lens is only going to provide a good image in the center of your frame. Second, if you're going to crop in the camera, or you're going to crop either in the For example, I will use square framing on some images. I know I want square framing when I take the picture. And this is especially true when I'm using really wide angle lens or a fisheye. A lot of times I want to zoom that very wide angle lens so that it fills the corners on a square shot. I know I'm going to use a square shot. And so if I set the image area to square, I can know what I'm getting when I'm shooting in the field. Quality. Uh, why would anyone want less than the best quality? Well, quality is a name that at least Nikon uses to set between RAW and JPEG. And you want to take RAW unless you're in a very special situation, uh, which most of us are probably never in, where we're trying to output images really fast. If you shoot in RAW, you can forget about setting white balance. Uh, you can forget about setting the other settings that modify how the camera makes the JPEG. And you just save it all and fix it on your computer when you get it in. Now, size and compression. Size means the bit depth. And simple answer, you want the highest bit depth your camera will produce. Some cameras give you a choice between 14-bit and 12-bit raw images. Well, I'm sure you already understand that bit depth controls how many different gradations of brightness the camera will record for each of the three color channels. For example, if we talk about the red channel and we have an 8-bit depth, which is what JPEG is, you're going to get 2 to the 8th power, which is 256 different intensities of light recorded for each of the three color channels. So your pictures are going to be made up of 256 levels off 3 sensors. So that gives you the number of colors that your camera will record. If you record 12 instead of 8, you've got 4 between 12 and 8. 2 to the 4th is 16. So you have 16 levels of brightness recorded between each of the levels that would be recorded for JPEG. 14-bit gives you 4 times that. So when you bring the image back to the camera or back to the computer and you want to do adjustments in brightness, if you have a higher bit depth, you have a lot more data and you can make fine adjustments and not get lost. Now, a quick aside, if you're bringing JPEGs into your computer, you've got some phone pictures or you've got some old pictures you want to work, first thing to do before you make any adjustments is export those pictures as 16-bit TIFFs. Now, doing that doesn't give you more data, but it does enable your computer to make fine adjustments without having to move whole jumps between color intensities in the JPEG, so it can make these fine adjustments with a lot less destruction. Compression. Well, compression is a good thing because these raw files are really quite large. And large files like that are going to fill your memory card and they're going to slow down how fast your camera can clear its buffer into memory. So you're going to have shorter bursts. Your camera probably offers an option for raw compression. Using lossless raw compression is a no-brainer. Some cameras also offer a lossy compression, which means you lose, theoretically at least, some image quality by compressing, but you get a lot larger compression. You can get a lot more images on your card, and your buffer clears faster, which is the real benefit, so that when you're shooting bursts, you don't run out of space. Now, my camera has a really good lossy compression algorithm, and I use it all the time and don't notice the difference. But you kind of need to experiment with it and see what works best on your camera. Uh, JPEGs also happen sometimes when you use special features on your camera. For example, if I try and shoot more than 20 frames per second on this camera, it's going to give me JPEGs because the processor in the camera can't produce uh, full raw images at that rate. But if I'm willing to accept an 11 megapixel JPEG, it'll give me 125 frames a second. Well, there's some times when you want that higher frame rate. There are also some things like delighting and in-camera compositing that only output as JPEG. And, if you want those, you got to put up with JPEG. Color space. I don't hear you, Madeline. You're muted.
Quick question. How do you export a JPEG when you pull it in? Where do you go to do that?
Okay, if you save JPEGs on your camera and you move the files to the computer, they come in as JPEG.
Correct.
So you get in Lightroom and you select those files and click export.
Can you do that from Photoshop, or is that only Lightroom?
Well, you want to do this in Lightroom.
Okay, because I don't use Lightroom.
Well, do you use Camera Raw coming in?
Yeah. Well, it
Right.
depends. I have two cameras. My little point and shoot is only JPEG, and that's the one I have in my pocket all the time.
All right. Well, when you're in Camera Raw, it works the same as Lightroom.
Okay.
You can export as a TIFF, or you could export as a 16-bit PDF.
Okay.
Now, you can set up Camera Raw and Lightroom so that whenever you move pictures to Photoshop, they automatically come in as 16-bit PDFs.
Okay.
But a lot of times, folks will have that image in Lightroom and, hi, I can hear you. See you waving. I can't hear you.
You said 16-bit PDF. Think you meant something else.
Well, TIFF or PSD?
PSD is what I meant.
PSD or TIFF.
PSD. I'm sorry. PDF is what Acrobat uses, and I go, yeah,
Right.
it's PSD. I'm sorry. Photoshop is
I'm
PSD.
listening.
Yeah, thank you.
He's awake. My goodness, look at that. He's had his coffee.
So anyhow, before you make any adjustment with those JPEGs, change them into a 16-bit format, whether it be a TIFF. If all you're going to do is increase the clarity in Lightroom or in Camera Raw, and you're not going to take the file to Photoshop, make the change to 16-bit in Lightroom before, or Camera Raw, before you make any of those adjustments.
Okay.
And you'll get fewer artifacts and a cleaner adjustment. Oh boy. Now we're going to talk about the viewfinder. When I was giving the camera tour, I mentioned the diopter adjustment control. Now, what I think we're going to do is look through the camera. And so I'm going to switch over here, pick up my camera and hit the focus button, and you should start to see. Yeah, now you can see through my camera. All right, viewfinder level, you have options, and what it's looking at isn't what's important. It's the spots and dials that you see that you're interested in. On a lot of cameras, you can change what you see or the way the display works. So in this instance, there are a lot of things on this display, and I'm going to go through some of them. I'm going to go clockwise from the top corner. First, you see I'm an aperture priority. I'm shooting 20 frames per second. I've got autofocus continuous, which means that whenever I press the focus button, it will focus. As you know, I've turned off focus on the shutter button. The alternatives are manual focus. Whoop, it's timing out on me. The alternatives are manual focus and autofocus single. Now, autofocus continuous is wonderful. You press the button, it focuses, take your finger off, and it doesn't focus anymore. Uh, I don't know why anybody would use autofocus single, because you can control it by whether you have your finger on the button or not. Now, the next group of slides is how the camera sensor focuses. And I've got it set for a wide area single, and then it's detecting faces. Going over further is white balance, which I don't really care about. It tells me that I'm shooting large raw files. The scale up and down at the side is showing you how my exposure compensation is set. And on this camera, I always have it set to -1, or at least that's the goal, because the camera tends to shoot hot. There's a battery indicator.
Wait a minute, hold on. If you're shooting in manual, does exposure comp doesn't work anyway, right?
Well, if you're shooting in manual, the indicator will tell you whether it thinks whether it thinks your exposure is right.
Other than a histogram, okay.
Yeah, it will scroll up and down based upon what it whether it agrees or disagrees
Okay,
with how
interesting.
you've got the camera.
Yeah, I don't think my camera does that, but that's okay.
Going across the bottom are the exposure settings. The bottom left corner shows you I'm in matrix metering. And that's mainly what you're seeing from this screen. But what I want to do is I want to hit the display button and show you that you can cycle through different display alternatives, and you can set this however you want. Now, grids. When do you use grids? Well, grids can be pretty distracting, all this stuff going on. But if you know in advance that you're going to crop, say you know in advance you're going to crop to a 1:3 ratio, you can display the grids and see where the corners of your image are going to be when you get it back on your computer. So you can pre-plan. Also, you can set this for thirds so you can see rule of thirds. You can see I have a histogram in here and move it around. Let's see what happens if I purposefully, oh, I'm looking at the light up here, and see I got that band. You can see it on the, sometimes it goes all the way to the right. And that's a way of knowing that I would have overexposure. Press the display button again. You see the horizon, so I can tell what I'm level. And some people would, and see I'm shooting down. Now I'm shooting up. You see the lines move in the center. Some people will tell you that all this information in your viewfinder simply drives you nuts.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a matter of whatever you like. That's why I've got buttons set so that I can make it do whatever I want it to do. Now, if I'm shooting on a tripod, shooting landscape, you can bet that I'm going to have this display up. So I know when my camera is level in the field. It also can be of some benefit normally, because I tend to shoot at an angle about like this most of the time. If I'm not paying attention, it can help me self-correct. But it gives you the option to put this stuff where you can see it. Let me look down here. Grid, histogram, I covered all that. Shutter release options. Okay. You can have it set for, you press it and you get one picture. You can have it so you press it and it continues to shoot at different rates. I always have my camera set to shoot at the fastest rate unless I'm doing something special like flash or on a tripod. Doesn't make sense to have it shooting fast when you're on a tripod because you've got everything set on a static scene. If you're shooting on flash, you don't want it shooting fast because your flash can't keep up with it. But if I'm shooting just, uh, you know, a sports section or even just family, uh, I will try and get, you know, 3 or 4 shots every time I point the camera, because chances are one of those shots, everybody's got their eyes open. And if I shoot just one, somebody is going to be off on their appearance, or I'm going to be a little bit out of focus. And so these are digital pictures. They're free. Take lots. Now we're going through the different options of what the shutter can be set to do. Another one is self timer. Now, with the self timer, you can tell it to press the button, trigger the shutter, and then you wait for it to take the picture. And you can tell it how long to wait. On a lot of cameras with the self timer, you can also tell it, and after you've waited, you take more than one picture. So you can tell it to take a string of pictures after the wait time is up. So how do you use it? First thing, you can use it, and I use this a lot, in lieu of a cable release, because you have a certain amount of vibration whenever you touch your camera. But if you have a scene, it's a static scene, you're shooting landscape, for example, on a longer shutter speed, or you're shooting a long lens and you know that there's going to be shake in that image if you just press the button when you press the button. Set it on the self timer, give it time to quit shaking, and then it takes the picture without having to touch the camera again. So that can save your neck when you're out and you need a remote cable and you don't have one. The other thing is with bracketing exposures. If you're doing, let's say I told you I do a 9-shot sequence when I bracket exposures. Well, I set the auto timer to take 9 shots after it starts taking pictures. So it can set it up on the tripod and then press the button, and 3 seconds or 5 seconds later, it burps off that run of 9 pictures. I don't have to touch the camera again in order to go through my whole series of bracketed shots. Now, exposure, you did have different modes. Well, where am I here? Okay. Got to get my glasses. These are my secret weapon when I want to see my notes. Oh, finally, mirror lock. If you have a DSLR and you're shooting a longer lens, when the shutter, before the shutter opens, the mirror slaps up. And that mirror slapping up will create a certain amount of vibration. And it can significantly affect your pictures if you're shooting a very long lens off a tripod. So with mirror lockup, you press the button once, the mirror locks up, press the button again, and it takes the picture. All right, well, there's a better way. If you shoot in live view, the mirror is up because it has to go up in order for the light to reach the sensor in order to produce the image on the back of your camera. And so you don't have that vibration problem. If you shoot in live view and then trigger the camera with a self timer, you've eliminated the vibration. Now we're going to move to exposure. So this is a different topic. Okay. Exposure, you know that there are 3 parts of the exposure triangle. There's how long the shutter's open, there's how big the hole is in the aperture, and there's how sensitive the screen is, the ISO value. And you want to control some of this. Some of it you want the camera to control. And these settings enable you to determine whether you're setting the settings or the camera is controlling the settings. Now, optimal ISO, there's an optimal ISO on every camera, and it's usually pretty low. 100 on most cameras, 64 on some. When you're on the optimal ISO, you get the largest dynamic range. In other words, it will record the largest range of brightnesses, and it will record with the least noise, but it's slow. And as you raise that ISO, you increasingly compromise both noise and dynamic range, but sometimes you have to do it because you have to have a fast shutter to stop action, or you have to narrow down the aperture in order to increase depth of field. And so it's always a compromise between those three values. So how are you going to shoot? Well, first let's talk about auto ISO. You can set the camera so that it will determine the ISO value. And that's what I use most of the time. Well, pretty much all the time, unless I'm on a tripod. I can see the ISO in my viewfinder. So it isn't like I'm completely abandoning the idea. But when I need to know what the shutter speed is, particularly, or the aperture to some degree, and I want that bird, and I know I need a thousandth of a second if I'm going to stop that bird. And I know that if I don't use a fast enough shutter speed, I've got nothing. So I have to turn up the shutter, and I know it's going to drive the ISO up. I'll set it on auto. And if I get a picture, fine. If it's too dark, I don't get a picture. Well, that happens. But I can't pull the ISO down because I have to have the shutter speed to get the shot. I use ISO almost all the time when I'm auto ISO, almost all the time when I'm hand holding. Now you can use auto ISO with manual, with shutter priority, and with aperture priority. With manual, you set the aperture, you set the shutter, and the camera, well, you can either set the ISO or you can have auto ISO on. When is this good? Well, um, you can use this when you're shooting, let's say you're shooting sports, and you know you need that shutter speed, and you know you're going to be shooting wide open because you want all the light you can get. Well, you can just set that with manual, and you know you're going to get it. Uh, Shutter priority is a lot the same, except it gives you an advantage that manual doesn't. If you're shooting going in and out of bright light, um, sometimes if you're not careful, you can overexpose pictures. And if you have shutter priority and you get in too bright a light, it will close down the aperture for you in order to keep you from overexposing. So this is a really good mode for like shooting children in the park, and they're going back and forth on the swing. Some of the time they're in the shadow and some of the time they're in the sun, and you can and you would overexpose the sun part. You can set the shutter priority, and then it will make those adjustments for bright light. Aperture priority, you can have the camera set the shutter speed and you control the aperture. Now, I do not combine this with auto ISO because when I'm using aperture, uh, I am trying to control depth of field. And I'm usually on a tripod and I don't care what the shutter speed does. So I set the ISO to my optimum ISO and control the depth of field with the aperture and let the shutter speed go wherever it's going to go. You see, it's a matter of figuring out which of these four variables you care about and then letting the other go where it needs to go. Exposure compensation. Okay, I already told you that my camera shoots about a half a stop hot. I didn't hear. I'm sorry. Okay. Exposure, your camera will determine the exposure value that it thinks is right. But this sometimes you want to go hotter or you want to go colder for a particular scene. And exposure compensation lets you either raise the exposure over what the meter would default give you or lower it. Let's use a couple examples. Let's say you're shooting kids playing in snow. All right, snow is very bright and you want it to be white in your image, not blown out, but just under blown out. But if you meter in that snow, it's not going, the camera doesn't know it's snow and it's trying to make that snow gray like if it were metering off grass. And so it's not going to be bright enough. And so you want to raise the exposure compensation so that your image is brighter than it would ordinarily be, same on sand. You can also use exposure compensation to darken the image. Let's say you're shooting onto a stage and what you care about is the performer, but the performer's under a spotlight. If you normally meter, it's going to meter for the whole scene. Even with spot metering, it doesn't work real well. And you have to turn the exposure down so that it doesn't blow out the brightest part of the image. Anyhow, that's a dial adjustment. There's a button on your camera that lets you do that. I talked earlier about exposure bracketing. One thing you want to watch with exposure bracketing, let's say you set up a 9-stop bracket. So it's going to take a picture, move 1 stop for a series of 9 pictures. You have to watch out what the ends are doing because if your camera, for example, a Nikon camera will only meter for 30 seconds. If those images where you're trying to bring up the darkest parts end up going so long on the shutter that you're maxed out at 30 seconds on the 7th, 8th, and 9th images, that those aren't helping you. So you're going to have to raise your ISO or open up your aperture so you're getting more light in that camera, even if it means compromising other variables to some degree so you can get the benefit of that full span of the bracketing. Now, between spot metering and exposure compensation, I can use spot metering much, much faster in the field than I can rolling that exposure compensation. And as I mentioned earlier, if I can point the camera at an area that's going to be typical of the part of the subject that I want, hit the spot meter button, and then hit the button that I've programmed to lock exposure, then I can move that camera around and the meter's not going to be changing the exposure. And I can compose the scene for the exposure that I want on the part of the scene that I want. Next page, page 5, metering. Oh my, there's so many options. You can choose how much of the scene the light meter considers when it gives you its recommended exposure value. Matrix works great most of the time. It takes in all or most of your viewfinder area and tries to approximate the exposure that you most likely want. But as I mentioned, if what you really want is to properly expose something that's very dark or very light within the scene, you're going to have to make adjustments from what Matrix gives you. Most cameras have center weighted option. Well, I never use it because I always get better results either with Matrix or with Spot, and I put the spot on the part that I care about the most. And center weight is kind of a compromise in the middle. And I can do better with other options. Now, some of the newer Nikon cameras, and I suppose some others, have a second kind of spot metering that compensates for spotlights. can use this setting and shoot someone on a stage under a spotlight, and it will not blow out the performer under the light. Uh, it's rarely helpful, but it can be very helpful in those limited circumstances. We already covered exposure lock, and so I'm going to move to focusing. Now, I confess that when I'm working with camera settings, uh, focusing and metering both use parts of the screen for the camera to help you get the setting that you want. And I get confused because they're both, you're adjusting the part of the screen that you want to use for both. And I have to consciously think, now, am I wanting to adjust the exposure? Am I going to want to adjust the focus? Because I can hit the wrong button. But before we go into how the camera focuses, we need to talk about some settings that influence the way focus works on your camera. We talked about back button focus. Very important. I would turn that on. Single versus continuous. Set it for continuous unless there's a specific reason not to. Focus priority versus release priority. A lot of cameras will let you determine when you press the button, do you want the camera to take a picture, or do you want the camera to check first and see whether it thinks your camera is in focus before it takes the picture? Well, whether the camera thinks it's in focus doesn't matter to me. What I care about is whether I think it's in focus. And so I always set this to release priority, so that if my focus point has moved off of the part of the image that I care about and I've got the focus set, I don't want the camera telling me no. I want it to take the stinking picture. So otherwise you can miss shots using focus priority. Now, focus locking, I'm on page 7, is different than exposure locking. We talked earlier about programming a button for exposure lock. Cameras also let you program a button to lock focus or lock focus combined with locking exposure, or some of them it will lock focus if you press the shutter down halfway. You don't want to lock focus. You don't ever want to lock focus. Use back button focus. If you don't want the focus to change, take your thumb off the button. If you want it to focus, put your thumb on the button. You don't ever need focus lock. Preview. You know that if you stop down the aperture, you're going to get a deeper depth of field in your picture. A larger slice of the distance is going to be in clearer focus. And that's important in some circumstances. It's important in landscape photography, can be important in portrait photography. And on all the old film cameras, if you press this button right here, this front top button below the shutter, whoop, I don't know if you can see it with my big thick fingers, this one, it would close down the lens and let you see the depth of field. When it closed down the lens, it also meant there was a whole lot less light in the viewfinder. And so you press the button and you can see the depth of field, except you can't see it because it's so darn dark. Not much good on a DSLR, and not a whole lot of good on a film camera either, because it gets dark. What are the alternatives? Well, I pretty much know my lenses and know what kind of depth of field I'm going to get with aperture. And so I don't need to be checking the depth of field preview. I do have a button set now for it because this camera's got so many different buttons that I have buttons to spare. And so I put my button for movie recording on preview. But the other way is to just shoot the picture. The better way is just shoot the picture and then look on your playback. And it's going to show you right there what the camera saw. And if you don't like the depth of field, you can quickly adjust your aperture and reshoot. And that will give you a foolproof way of seeing what your pictures are in the field. As I said earlier, I have that preview button programmed to move instantly to spot metering because I use that constantly. Well, not constantly, but very frequently when I'm shooting in the field, so that I don't have to change the dials or anything. I can just get a quick spot meter. Lens calibration. Okay, this is for DSLR users, not for mirrorless users, because mirrorless cameras give you the focus based on the light that is actually hitting the sensor. And so when it focuses, it's showing you a true focus. But a DSLR, when you focus through the prism, not when you focus on the screen on the back, because when you focus on the screen on the back, it works the same as a mirrorless. But when it goes through the mirror, up through the prism, and then out to your eye, it can only approximate the focus that's going to come when it hits the sensor screen. And there's variability in almost all lenses. And so most cameras have an adjustment that you can get a unique focus for each lens, and it will record that. And especially for longer lenses on a DSLR, it's important to do this focus calibration. Our club in the library has focus calibration targets. I bought them and put them there, and it's because it's really important with longer lenses. Short lenses, wide angle lenses, it doesn't matter because the depth of field is pretty thick anyway, and these fine differences in focus are less likely to affect your images. Now, manual focus. I want to demonstrate focus peaking. In case you haven't seen it, I'm going to turn the image so that you're looking through my camera again. Here we go. All right. Turn on my camera and take off my glasses. Now I'm going to look at my keyboard here and focus. All right. Now, if I turn my focus a little, whoop, now we're starting to see those red images coming across the keys. I hope you're seeing it. If you're not seeing it, tell me. As I move in and out, there's a little bit of red highlight that tells me exactly where my camera is in focus. So let's say I were shooting a flower in the field. Now, we're going to talk in a second about using the camera's ability to move the focus forward and back. But a lot of times in the field, when you're shooting a bug or shooting a flower, what you do is you come in here and let me try and do this. Okay, okay, I want several areas in focus. So I'm going to do a focus stack. So I start pushed in so that the furthest away part of my image that I care about is in focus. See the red spots way at the top? And then I'll shoot a series of pictures moving backwards. See there? Now the closest part is in focus. And then when I stack these, I'll have a series of images that I can focus stack across the frame. But the beautiful part of the focus peaking is you can see exactly which part, particularly in a close-up image, is in focus. And I think it's a pretty valuable feature. There is another feature. Whoop, I'm going to go back so that you can see me again. Oh, did you miss me? I'm back. Um, there is a feature on a lot of cameras that will let you uh, have the camera automatically advance the focus. And that works well for making focus stacks if you are on a tripod and everything and nothing is moving. For this feature, you set the camera on the closest part of the image. When I did this with the demonstration we just did on focus peaking, I moved forward to the furthest part of the image, and then I pulled backwards. The reason for that is you'll run into things if you start back and move your camera forward. I start and get the focus on the farthest away part of my flower or bug or whatever, and then move slowly backward so that the closest part comes into focus. If you're using the features uh, that will automatically advance your focus, it's going to start with the closest and then gradually increment your lens, actually changing the focus in the lens up until infinity is in focus. You just need to know that when you set it up. Whenever you're doing focus stacking, either way, you want to shoot very wide in the sense that I mean that you need to leave a lot of margins. So if you want this part of your image to be in focus, you want to shoot the image this wide so you can crop off a lot of the edges, because when you stack those images, there are going to be imperfections at the edge. And so you need to have a wider view in order not to have artifacts in the part of the image that you want to use. Now, so how does the camera decide where it's going to focus? Basic method that DSLRs use is single point autofocus. You have this little box in your screen, you put it where you want it to focus, you hit the button, and it focuses for that spot. Mirrorless cameras, we're going to go back to the camera for you real quickly, have other options. Okay, we're back to the camera. Whoa, here we are. I got to change the aperture on this so I get it more wide open. Okay. With this camera, you can set it to pick up people. You can set it here. It's going to track this person as it moves around the frame. Let's say this were a ball player moving around the frame or a bird flying across your screen. This is basically plain old DSLR. Put the face in the focus box and hit the button. Which of these works best? Oh, the answer really is it depends on the scene, and you have to play with it to figure out what's going to work best for you. I shot a football game where one autofocus mode worked best for one team, another autofocus mode worked best for the other team because their colors or their uniforms were different. One was very dark and one was very light. So I was going back and forth between modes, basically from shot to shot, by using different buttons on my camera. If you've got a DSLR, life is so much simpler. You've got one mode of autofocus, and then you can focus off the screen on the back, and that doesn't work very well, especially if things are moving. The thing that enabled manufacturers to go to mirrorless was improvement in the technology for focusing off the screen so you can keep up with moving objects. So the main message on that, and you can also change the autofocus so that it selects off of different parts of the frame. You can have it select a small area or a wider area. And you basically just have to play with your camera and see what works for you. And whatever you choose isn't going to work consistently. And so you're going to have ways to compensate for that. Now, the mystery of flash photography. Um, there are just a few things to keep in mind with flash photography, and I'm going to keep it simple because my knowledge is pretty simple, and I don't want to confuse myself any more than I already am. The important innovation with flash technology is through the lens metering. Now, how this works is you press the shutter button down, and okay, you've told it to take the picture. And before it takes your picture, it will have the flash emit a pre-flash. And then it will measure the light coming back off that pre-flash. And then it will set how hard it wants the flash to power, whether it wants it to release its full power or whether it wants to release a quarter of a power or an eighth of a power. It'll adjust the intensity of the flash emission based on the light that came back from that pre-flash. And it does this so quickly that you don't even realize it happened. Yeah. So what you want to do to make flash work is you want to have a way to control how much, this is basically the fill flash discussion. You want to be able to control how the camera interprets this pre-flash data that's coming back to the camera. Because every scene is different, and all the camera can do is make an educated guess about how bright you want that flash to be. So there is flash compensation that enables you, just like exposure compensation, to adjust how powerful that flash is. So you take the picture, you look at the picture, you see if it's got too much flash or too little, and you adjust the flash compensation. How do you meter for flash? How do you set your ISO and your aperture and your shutter speed? Well, first of all, you're not going to want to use auto ISO because then it's, at least on my cameras, it's all confused between, well, do you want the ISO that's right for the background? Do you want the ISO for the area that you're flashing? And it doesn't know what to do. So I turn auto ISO off. I'm usually shooting manual, to tell you the truth, but some cameras are smart enough that they can work with aperture priority or shutter priority. Let's say that you're doing, okay, flash sync speed. Flash sync speed, important to understand. When you take a picture, let's say you take a picture at 1,000th of a second. There are two curtains on your shutter. The front curtain starts to go down, and then the back curtain will start to come down before the front curtain has reached the bottom, so that there is a slit within your picture that has the shutter open, but the shutter is not open at the same time over the whole picture because it takes longer than 1,000th of a second for that shutter to travel. Let's say you shoot for a quarter of a second. Well, your front curtain is going to open, and then it's going to be all the way open for a while. Then your back curtain is going to close behind. Flash sync speed is your highest flash sync speed is the highest speed that will have a sufficient period where the front is open before the back starts to close for the flash to go off while the entire sensor is exposed. If you set your shutter at higher than the high flash sync speed, the result is going to be that your flash only exposes the band of the sensor that is uncovered by the front and the back curtain at the moment, at the instant that the flash pops. So you'll get a band that's properly exposed, and you'll have a black area at the top or the bottom, or maybe it'll be up or down, but you won't have the whole sensor exposed. On most cameras, the flash sync speed is 1/200th or 1/250th. It can be less. It's not going to be more. And so you want to use a shutter speed at least as fast as the flash sync speed set for, and your manual will tell you what it is for your camera and your flash. Otherwise, you'll have this banding unless you have a camera with high speed sync. Now, if your camera has high speed sync, what it will do, as let's say we're on 1,000th of a second, as this band moves across your sensor, it will emit a series of flashes so that there is a flash for each of the bands. And it's not one flash, it's many flashes, but it will light up the whole scene. Flash sync speed high speed sync also significantly reduces the power that your flash is going to be able to put out on any given strip because it has to flash repeatedly over several different areas. But you can play with it. Your manual will tell you about it if you've got that feature. You have to have a flash that matches your camera pretty closely in order to make that work. But that's what flash sync speed is all about. So how do you set your camera for fill flash? The secret, the real secret is you set your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture to properly expose the background, even if you don't care about the background. That has to be your first concern. And then you add flash to expose the foreground. Your flash is probably not going to reach into your background anyway. So what you want to think about, let's say you have a person standing in the foreground, but you want to be able to show the scenery in the background. Well, that person may be dark and may need to be lit up a little, but if you set your exposure for the background, you'll get that background, and then you pop a little light in on top of it. So your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO are set to properly expose the background, and then you add flash on top. That's the concept of fill flash. Now, your flash settings on your camera probably have other options. Probably your camera has a slow sync option. Okay, slow sync, slow sync is just like fill flash, except fill flash settings are usually trying to protect you from subject movement. And usually it will give you a flash between your maximum flash sync speed and a 60th of a second, because if it gives you a shutter opening larger than a 60th of a second, there's a pretty good chance that your person in the foreground is going to move and you're going to get a blurry picture. So if you're using aperture priority, it's going to select a shutter speed in that range. Slow sync takes the bottom out so that your camera will allow for a longer shutter speed, and that doesn't protect you on subject movement, but it enables you to get more light in the camera for a long period of time. So if you've got your camera on a tripod, so you don't have to worry about camera shake, and you tell your person to be very still, and you need more light, and you shoot slow sync, you may be able to get away with a longer shutter speed. Rear curtain sync. Okay. It's just like slow sync, and yeah, it's just like slow sync, except in slow sync, the flash pops as soon as the shutter is fully open. And then it stays open for however long it takes to get the exposure. With slow sync, the shutter opens. And then just before the shutter closes, the flash pops. Okay, let's say you're taking a picture of a moving car and you shoot with slow sync. You're going to take the picture and the car is going to show, and then the car is going to continue to move through the frame. So you've got the car frozen at the front, and then you've got the blurred movement of the car throughout the rest of the time the shutter is open. If you shoot rear curtain sync, the shutter will open and the car will blur as it comes through, and then the flash pops at the end. So you've got the blur behind the car rather than the blur in the front of the car. Does that make sense?
You just said that the flash, both of them, the flash pops just before the shutter closes.
No,
Should,
then I didn't speak clearly. With slow sync, the shutter pops when the flash first opens,
when the
and
shutter
then-
first opens.
and then you get the blur after that. So you'll see the car, and then you'll see blur in front of it, which isn't the way we think about cars. If you
Right.
use rear sync, you'll see the blur coming up to the last part of the exposure, and then you'll see the flash, and you'll see the car with the blur behind it.
Right.
That's what rear sync gives you. You need to be aware that camera movement is going to be a real factor, and you're probably going to want to be using a tripod in both of these. Night flash photography with TTL, with through the lens, it's pretty confusing for most cameras because it sends out that pop and the pop just disappears into the night. And so it's likely to think, well, golly, we're not getting much back from that flash. We need to increase the intensity of the flash. But it's likely to guess that you need more flash than you really do. So you're probably going to be turning down the exposure compensation. Let's say you're taking a picture of a romantic couple standing in front of the city lights. You're probably not going to be able to get the couple or yourself to hold still long enough to both get the city lights properly exposed and the couple. So what I suggest doing is put that camera on a tripod, properly exposed for the background, get you a good shot of the background, and then take another shot, or first shot without the flash, take another shot, move the couple in, and use your flash, and then composite the two. That will get you around problems where there's just too much difference between the bright and the dark. We are almost to the end of this. We're on page 11. Viewing pictures on playback. Most cameras default that when you press the shutter button, you take a picture, the picture pops up on the screen on the back of the camera. Bad idea. It's bad because it's distracting for you. It's distracting for people. Sometimes people see your picture and you don't want them to. And worst yet, while that picture is up, the controls on the back of your camera are trying to adjust the playback. And so if you're moving on to the next shot, you can be hitting those controls and moving around your focus point. And all it's doing is moving that picture around and not changing what you need to see for the next picture. So turn off preview. And then you can play it back when you want to play it back by pressing the playback button, but don't have auto preview on. How to use preview in the field? Well, there are different, well, let's see if we can make this work. I'm going to go back to the camera. We're going to go back to the camera. Okay. Now we're going to get an important shot here and play it back. Okay. Now, what I'm looking for are blinkies.
Hmm.
Well, I'm going to overexpose this thing. Is what I'm going to do. I'm going to lock my exposure. I'm going to go up, take a picture of the light. And I know this is going to be overexposed. So we're going to play it back. And I'm looking for the screen that has the blinkies. See the blinkies? That anything that blinks in this frame is likely overexposed. And in this case, it's all overexposed. When I show the histograms, you're going to see, well, it's hard to see here, but all the way to the right, it's pegged out on the edge of the histogram. And you can use this as a way to tell in the field whether you're blowing out highlights. Let's shoot again here and try and get something that's not as blown out. Okay, there's the ceiling. And the part of the ceiling that's closest to the light up in the top right corner is blinking. That is telling me that that area is blown out. You can set this to show when you press playback. Here you're seeing histograms. You can see the histogram is piled up on the right side of the screen. The top of the top histogram is composite red, green, and blue, or red, yellow, and blue. Red, red, green, and blue, and the top one has got all of them, and then it's got the individual channels. You can blow out a single channel in some images. If you have, let's say there's a lot of red in your image, but not much else, your composite histogram can look pretty okay, but one of these can be piled up on the right, and that's going to give you problems too. Let's scroll through these. You can get more information in the playback if you want. A lot of these cameras, you can set what information you want to happen on playback. And you can, and whoa, let's go back here. You can zoom in. You can zoom way in or come back out. Good way in the field to tell if your image is the image that you want it to be. But the histogram and the blinkies are a very quick way. You see, back when we used to shoot film, even if you were mostly blowing out your highlights, let's say a wedding dress, you want it to be pretty white, but because of the way that the emulsion works, it's probably going to capture some small amount of detail unless you really blow it out, even at the high end. But with digital cameras, uh, it's an all or nothing deal. Once you go over the edge, you're not getting any detail back. If you find that you've blown out highlights, you have to reshoot the image in the field or you're not going to have an image. There are a few other miscellaneous settings that we cover on the last 2 pages of the handout. Um, a lot of cameras will have built-in vibration reduction. A lot of lenses will have built-in vibration reduction. Most cameras, if you have vibration reduction in the lens, it's going to automatically turn off the vibration reduction in the camera. So you get one or the other. It's helpful, but it's only helpful for camera shake on your end. If the thing in your image is moving, vibration reduction isn't going to help you get a lower shutter speed. If that bird's flying through the air, you're going to need 1,000th, 1,500th of a second in order to stop that bird. And camera shake isn't going to be a factor because you can't shake enough to change. Well, you can, but you're going to have to try to keep you from getting a sharp image if you have the shutter speed turned up for the subject. So they advertise about how, oh golly, you can get another 2 stops, 3 stops lower shutter speed. But if you're shooting the family at a 20th of a second, uh, you may not have any shake blur, but they're going to be moving, and you just can't lower the shutter speed down that low and get the sharp image. So you have to keep your shutter speeds up, even if you've got vibration reduction. Vibration reduction is helpful. If you're shooting handheld landscape and you need to go down to a 20th of a second, uh, with a 50 millimeter lens or so, you can get away with it. Uh, there are people who say standard wisdom is if you're shooting on a tripod, turn off your vibration reduction because it itself can cause some alteration in your image and cause it not to be sharp because it can try and compensate when there is nothing to compensate for. That's the standard wisdom. So if you know your camera is rock solid, they would say to turn off the vibration reduction. I leave it on all the time. There's two reasons for that. First reason is I've never, in a good newer camera, I've never had a problem with vibration reduction being on and causing a degradation of the image, even when I'm shooting on a tripod. The other thing is tripods are not always that solid. If you have a little bit of breeze, if you have a truck rolling by in the background, you can have vibration even when you're on a tripod, and having the vibration reduction on can be of some benefit. I haven't found it to be a harm, so I leave it on. Long exposure noise reduction. Some cameras have a feature that when you take a picture, let's say you take a 3-second picture because it's in the evening and you want to see the lights, or you're trying to get the water to smooth as the ocean waves go by. You take a long exposure, and long exposures are prone to developing noise in the image, even at even at lower ISOs. And so the theory is, well, if the camera takes your image and then immediately takes a second image with the shutter closed, and then internally compares those two images, the image it records can subtract the noise in the second image with the shutter closed from the first image, and it will eliminate the noise from the sensor that came in due to the long exposure. Long explanation. Turn it off. I turn it off for two reasons. First, I can get that little bit of extra noise out in post-processing using Photolab or using Topaz, and I don't need the camera's help. The other is, if you run a 3-second exposure and then it runs another 3-second exposure, it takes twice as long to get your shots. Well, that's fine, but let's say you're doing astrophotography and you've got your exposure open for 5 minutes, and then it takes another 5-minute image for the long exposure reduction. It takes long enough to get those shots standing out in the cold anyway. It just isn't worth the benefit. Photo flicker reduction. Yeah, that's cool. Fluorescent lights tend to flicker. They flicker faster than your eye can see, but not faster than your camera can see at higher shutter speeds. And what photo flicker reduction does is you press the shutter and it waits to take the picture to a moment when to a moment when the light is fully on, not during a time when it's flickering off. This happens so fast that you don't perceive the difference, but it can help your images. I leave it on. We talked earlier about focus shift shooting, when your camera will advance the focus for you, or you can use the technique that I described to move in and out on the image. The takeaway on both of these is, if you're going to do focus stacking, shoot 2, 3 times more images than you think you're going to need, because invariably something is going to go wrong and you're going to have too much space between some images. You can always throw away the images after you get them on the computer, but you can't create them if you didn't take them in the field. So take lots of extra. Final 2 items on page 13, clean image sensor. Most of our cameras have a feature in the menu that when you turn it on, it will shake your sensor so that some of the dust will fall off. I have my camera set so that it will run every time I turn the camera off. There's no harm in doing it. At least run it every time you have the camera open and change lenses. There is a second feature for cleaning the sensor, and this is mirror lockup for cleaning. What this does is it will cause the camera to hold the mirror up and hold the shutter open so that you can take the lens off and see all the way back into your camera where the sensor is. Now, sometimes we get dust on our sensors. These are electronic components, and static electricity seems to attract dust. You get dust on your sensor, and then you're going to have that dust spot on all of your pictures. So periodically, I recommend using the lift mirror for cleaning, holding your camera upside down, and spraying air in there on your sensor to blow the dust out. Sometimes that's all you need to do if you've got dust on your sensor. Give it a good blowing, and then take another picture, such as of the sky, and pull out the pull out the exposure so you can see the dust, and you can tell if you've got it clean. Uh, I do that quite frequently because I don't like dust on my sensor. If that doesn't work and you have something that's stuck on that you can't get off with an air blower, you can do a wet cleaning. Now, this is a job, unless you know what you're doing, you want a professional to do this. But you can get swabs special for the size sensor that you have and a special cleaning fluid.
Mhm.
Watch the YouTube videos. And I learned how to do it. You can learn how to do it. You
It's
may
super-
not want to do it. You can damage your camera if you do it wrong. But that's the last resort for cleaning sensors. And this is how you open the mirror and open the shutter so you can get access to that. But there's no harm at all in blowing it out, and I recommend doing that frequently. So this is my outline. I'm ready for your questions.
Well, first, thank you. This was pretty intense, and yeah, it gets me to review. You were talking about the manuals. Every camera I get, there's a guy named David Bush who seems to write manuals on each camera. They're also hundreds of pages, but they're much better organized than so I had it for Canon, I have it for Sony. I don't like the Sony. I'm going to look for a new camera, but there's so much in there.
Will you hold that book up for the
Sure.
camera so
Yeah.
that folks can see it?
This is for the Sony. I also had it for the Canon Rebel series. He does them for an enormous, I have no idea how many cameras he does these manuals for, but they're very, very handy and helpful. He gives recommended settings as you go through it. And again, similar to what you've done here, but much more detailed for each camera and every setting in the camera.
Yeah, that's the problem that I had when I got my first DSLR.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
It had all these settings, and I had a mentor at the time that was a professional AP photographer. She had retired. And so I went to her and I said, "Oh, all these settings, what am I going to do?" And she says, "Oh, don't worry about it. There'll be 3 or 4 things that you change all the time, and just forget about the rest of it."
Yeah.
Well, there's considerable truth in that, although it's not totally true, because there are a lot of features in these cameras that can really help you out if you know that they're there and know how to use them.
Right.
But you
I had a
can't let it
similar
drive you crazy.
experience. Yeah, when I first went on to electronic cameras as opposed to film, I just never, I got the camera and said, ugh. And I walked into a gallery. I was living in Florida at the time, and it happened to be the photographer who happened to be in the gallery at that moment, as opposed to just, a clerk selling
Yeah.
photos.
Yeah.
And I chatted with this guy, and he said, you took film, you just do the triangle, just do aperture, do, go on to manual, do what you did, and then look at one feature later, but just use the camera, just, figure out how to set the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed, and take pictures. And if you never use anything else, don't worry about it. And if you start to explore your camera, explore it. And it's true. I mean, I'm still doing that. I still shoot as if it were film. Some of these things, I hate this peaking. It drives me nuts because I see, it's like, what's this red stuff? It makes sense for photo stacking, but just for focusing, it drives me bananas because I'm seeing things that aren't there. These red lines or these red things. And I just find it incredibly distracting.
Turn it off.
I did. It's like, it's all off. It's all off. It's like, okay, what do I want on? The same thing with that, the vibration thing, the steady hold. Who the hell remembers if I put it on I'm not changing that when I put it on. I'll put something on a tripod. I'll take it off the tripod. I put it back on. It's like, are you kidding? I'm not pressing these buttons.
Yeah, leave it on.
Buttons.
Leave it on. It's not going to cause you any trouble.
Right. So that's a good one. I'll get rid of that in the function menu. Yeah. So it's like, it's like the metering and where I'm focusing are the only things that I really change.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. It's like, and I'll do, my camera has that directed manual focus, the Sony. So it'll do autofocus and then I'll fine tune it in. It's like, okay, I got this. It's really in focus or it's not. It's like, hey.
The other thing that I will do before I go out, I kind of know what environment I'm going into, and I set my camera up for what I'm doing that day. If I know I'm going to be shooting birds with a telephoto lens, I have those settings dialed in before I leave the house. And they're different if I'm going to be shooting landscape another day with a different lens. And if I do the thinking before I get out in the field, then when I get in the field, I can just shoot pretty much. Well, thank you for coming.
I agree with your thinking there. In my opinion, and I'm not objecting to anybody else's thought, is every time I take a shot, I try to go through and I want the shot to be as close to what I want, what I need, so there's less to do in post-processing. I hate being in front of the computer, changing the light balance unless I have to. I really don't do that. I don't want to make it in focus because I didn't use the right thing. I want to think about exactly what I'm visualizing and how it's going to appear, and every itty bitty button needs to be thought about. Now, I'm a landscape photographer and an astrophotographer, so I have time to do that. I don't shoot people. I don't shoot sports. I don't waste my time in that kind of thing. I've gone out and shot birds and said, oh God, this is as boring as fishing is, So for me, that's my thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody is different. And I tend to do a lot of different things. And so I tend to use a lot of different settings at different times. So, you just kind of have to know what your options are.
Yeah, when I see somebody saying that they spent 28 hours on Photoshop after taking a shot, it's like, I can't think that to me would be, watching golf or, watching fishing, which is even more boring. So it's like, I lived in Italy for a while and used to watch cactus grow. Now that's slow, but and I enjoyed that more than spending time on the computer, actually. So it's like watching cactus grow is more soothing to me than spending hours. And I'm into Photoshop sort of by hacks. Just give me a quick way to do, if it takes more than 2 minutes, I'm lost. It's like, just give me a hack to, make adjustments and it's sort of clarity, or I want to darken the whole thing and then I'll go back to history brush and just lighten up what I wanted light. I don't know how to use layers and masks. And it's like, do I really have to? So it's like,
I'm
I'm getting
different.
there slowly, but I want to get, I want to get down and dirty in Photoshop. I don't want to spend 20 hours. I think there was one person who did a workshop on landscapes, and he had said he had spent 26 hours working on that shot on the computer. It's like,
Most likely because there was something wrong with the exposure.
Well,
who knows? I mean, the guy does gorgeous stuff. He's a landscaper. He's all over everywhere. He sells a lot of his work. But that's, then you're getting into digital art, not, it's a different thing than photography. So if it's going to be digital art, I want to know it. I want it to look like digital art. But for me, it's not my thing. I want to do it in camera as much as possible also.
I'm different. I will spend 10 times as much time in front of the computer
Yeah.
as I spend in the field,
That
or
may-
more. And so I look on the field experience as a gathering of data that I can then take back to the computer where I make my pictures.
Yeah.
And that's a
right.
very different philosophy, but that's
Very
how I
different.
approach it.
Yeah, I might do some adjustments. I might, some dehaze, some clarity, bring out some textures. I'll play with those basic sliders, and that's really what I want. And I might crop, and not much. I'm not going to crop much either. Yeah, it's interesting. So interesting, different theories. This was very helpful. Thank you for doing this, Max.
Sure, you're welcome. And if there are other kinds of workshops that you think would be beneficial, or if people watching this video come up with ideas of videos that they'd like to see, let somebody know.
Yeah.
Either me or someone else in the club probably know how to do these things. Ask and ye shall receive. So,
I haven't seen any sort of workshops. I mean, I really need to work on Flash because I use it and then forget it because I don't use it often enough. But I haven't seen any workshops going on. Again, I'm not attending stuff because I'm still into COVID protocols here. Because so it's not that much anyway that I could do. I can do something with a group of 3 or 4, but I'm not doing large groups at all. It's just too dangerous for me. So if some sort of hands-on workshop would be fun to do again, but I don't know when. So if any of those are going on.
Something to think about. But Madeline, take those Flash suggestions in this handout and give it a try.
Yeah, what I need to do is do like Flash every day for a month so I don't forget how to use it from, the next time I want to use it, and also when to use it. That's the thing that is like, also, I don't know about filters. I am still trying to figure, I've been doing photography for a long time. Do I really know how to use a polarizer? Nah. I don't use it often enough and I don't get the effect of it. So even a workshop on filters,
Well, let me cover that. That's quick. That's easy. Okay, you need a circular polarizer if you're doing landscape primarily. You screw it on.
Got it.
And it's going to cost you 2 stops of light. So you have to think about that's going to slow your exposure down. And then you turn it, and there's 2 rings. One you screw into your camera,
right.
The outer one turns. And it's simply a matter of turning it and watching how it changes your image and setting it where you think it looks the best. You can over polarize an image. It's all a matter of what it looks like to your eye as you turn that polarizer.
All right. What about, doesn't the sun have to be like at a 90-degree angle and
for it to work best?
Okay.
But that doesn't really matter. If I'm taking a picture of this scene, if it works, it works. It doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I'm going to put it on there. I'm going to turn it and adjust it and see how it helps my image or how it doesn't.
Sounds good. That sounds easy enough. All right.
Yeah,
I can do that.
If it works, it works.
Right. Because
there is one caveat about that. if you have an extremely wide angle lens and you're shooting the lens, the polarizing effect will vary across the screen, across
Okay.
the image.
Yeah, I don't usually
That
shoot like
could
that wide.
be advantageous or it could be unlike a bad thing.
Mhm.
So just be aware of that.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank
Same
you,
if you're,
gentlemen.
same if you're shooting a panorama, you're going to have the same effect as that long lens.
Okay.
It's going to vary across. And let me tell you, if you use a polarizer and you want to try and get that effect out in Photoshop, it will drive you nuts
Okay.
because you have to use gradients to try and get it out. And man, I had some shots in the Sierras that I really over polarized, and that was a lot of work trying to fix those pictures.
Yeah, I would have just dumped it at that point. Yeah.
Well, the problem was this was an area that I wasn't going to go back to anytime soon, and I wanted to salvage those pictures pretty bad. Well, we're going to call it a day for this morning.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care and keep a smile.
You too. Stay healthy, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.